Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to the webinar and meeting of the Center for Transportation Studies, Safety and Traffic Flow Research Council. My name is Tony Fisher. I'm a highway planner at the Metropolitan Council, and I am the chair of the Safety and Traffic Flow Research Council. Let's see a little background on the councils. There are 4 research councils that provide a forum for transportation professionals and researchers to exchange information on current transportation issues and trends. They bring together university faculty and staff with practitioners from the public and private sector to recommend direction and participate in improving the center's research, education, and engagement programs. Today's webinar features presentations exploring the pedestrian experience in urban and rural areas across Minnesota. Our council vice chair, Joe Gustafson, is also here and helping co-facilitate this webinar. Joe, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Tony. For those that don't know me, my name is Joe Gustafson. I'm the traffic engineer for Washington County Public Works. I've been in this role since 2008, and prior to that had done some work for Metro City and also for MNDOT and another county. We've got 2 traffic engineers here in our traffic section at the county that we cover everything from signs to striping to operation of about 100 signals, and of course safety, in addition to reviewing a lot of plans and permits. I'm a 2001 grad of the U of M, so I've had some interaction with CTS since I was about age 17. My research interests are roundabouts and also pedestrian safety, and I'm involved in our Minnesota METCD committee, so I do quite a bit of work with those topics. I was also the 2016 president of our North Central section of the Institute for Transportation Engineers, but this is my first stint with any role for CTS. So great to be with you all.
Great, thank you, Joe. We also have with us Gina Boss and Katie Kirk from CTS, who are really the ones behind the scenes making these events happen. And Gina is going to share with us a thank you to the outgoing council chair, Steve Misgen.
Great, thanks, Tony. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see so many participants in the webinar and the council meeting today. It's really my great honor and privilege to be able to have this opportunity to say thank you to Steve Misgen, who's the Metro District Traffic Engineer for MNDOT, who has served on the in the leadership for the council for these last 6 years, and he's the outgoing chair. And we wanted to take a few minutes to recognize the work that he's done for CTS and in support of research at the.
Gina, you want mute?
I hit my button, sorry about that. For the last 6 years, Steve has served, as I said, as vice chair and then chair for the council. But, you know, CTS and me, we go way back further than that with Steve. So we've had a strong partnership over the years with Metro District and with the Office of Traffic Engineering. And Steve has really been critical to that partnership. He's a major, I can't stress it enough, champion for research at MNDOT throughout his many years there. So Steve and I we've been around for a while. Steve has served as technical lead on numerous research projects and has also served on countless more project panels for university research. And one of the things that I have really appreciated from Steve is that when we have had searches at the university for transportation engineering faculty positions, Steve has really been instrumental in pulling together folks from MNDOT to talk to these different candidates. And in talking with them, I know for a fact that strong partnership between the university and MNDOT has helped attract these folks to accept positions at the University of Minnesota. So we really appreciate it. So Steve, even though you're stepping back from a leadership position, I expect and I know that you will stay engaged with CTS and university research moving forward. And I'll just say personally, I'll miss hanging out and kind of our joking and teasing that we have whenever we have a chance to connect. So with that, again, on behalf of CTS and the university, thank you so much for the work that you've done and the volunteer time and effort that you've put in on our behalf. And with that, if you'd like to say a few words, Steve, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Gina. Geez, I didn't know you were going to bring up all my dirty laundry, maybe. I don't know. I've really enjoyed my tenureship on the council. It's been a great exposure to all the research that gets done at the university and the university system. I would like to thank the CTS staff. They do a superb job of and a great service to the university system by getting these research projects out there for practitioners in the engineering community to benefit from. I'm actually surprised at the amount of research that does get done that you never hear of. And I think CTS does a great job trying to get that information out there. In the past 6 years since I've been leading the council, we've heard a lot from researchers in the area of pedestrian safety, which we're going to hear some more here today. Effects of transit on livable communities, distracted driving, wheelage-based user fees, numerous topics on connected vehicles, and it's probably going to be the #1 topic going into the future. When I started on the council, it was, pie in the sky way out there. So might have had the only council meeting that it was interrupted by a fire drill, though. It wasn't actually a fire drill, it was actually a real fire alarm. So I had to chuck when I thought of that. But I encourage people to stay active in the council, sending reminders to your colleagues when you come across something that you feel they might be interested in. There is other councils besides traffic flow. They're not as good because this is the best one ever. But again, I think the council's in great hands with Tony and Joe and the rest of CTS staff. And thanks again, Gina and staff.
Great, thanks, Steve. Again, greatly appreciate the efforts that you've made on behalf of CTS and the university. So thank you. And with that, I'm going to turn things back to Joe and Tony.
All right, thank you, Gina. Through today's presentation, we're looking forward to audience participation and questions. We encourage you to use the raise hand feature, which you'll see down at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question that's particularly if it's one of an immediate nature, or type the word share in chat if you have a question or comment, and then we can unmute you to share verbally. Or if you prefer, you can use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen to type your question or comment for the speakers. There will be audience Q&A following the presentation. So with that, I also need to mention, as far as credit, this event meets the continuing education requirements for 2 professional development hours and 2 American Institute of Certified Planners, AICP certification maintenance credits. If you need a PDH form, please send a chat message to all panelists with your name and email, and CTS will email you the form following today's events. There is also recordings of our fall webinar here. CTS has held 3 other transportation research webinars this fall that you may be interested in. You're welcome to the link on the screen to view the recordings, and we'll also put this link in the chat shortly. I think Gina will do that. And finally, if there are any students joining today, could you please send a chat with your name? CTS likes to track the number of students who are engaging in our events. So thank you very much for that. With that, I will turn it back over to Tony.
Great, thank you, Gina and Joe. So today's webinar will focus on the pedestrian experience in urban and rural areas across the state. The first presentation will review a series of research projects conducted by the University of Minnesota's Transportation Observatory. It will highlight findings on the understanding of compliance with and effectiveness of different pedestrian crossing treatments. These range from the most simple unmarked crossing to more elaborate systems of pedestrian signals and pedestrian hybrid beacons. The second presentation will discuss a research project focused on pedestrian activity and safety on 4 Anishinaabe reservations. The project, conducted by University of Minnesota researchers in collaboration with MNDOT and the Advocacy Council on Tribal Transportation, focused on observing pedestrian activity and identifying countermeasures to reduce pedestrian risk at priority locations identified by tribal transportation managers. I'm pleased to welcome today's webinar speakers. John Herdos is the director of the Minnesota Traffic Observatory at the University of Minnesota. Greg Lindsay is a professor at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. And Michael Pettish is a pedestrian and bicyclist data coordinator for the Minnesota Department of Transportation. John?
Thank you, Tony. Let me share my screen. Okay, before I start my seminar, I'd like also to thank Steve for his long and dedicated devotion in helping the university academics not only do the research they want, but also do meaningful research and bring it to the industry. So thank you very much, Steve. My presentation, and I'm gonna close my video now, so there's no issue with speed. It talks about our experience with pedestrian crossing safety and efficiency in Minnesota through a number of projects that we had at the University of Minnesota, at the Minnesota Traffic Observatory. And I start from more of an engineering point of view, and Greg and Michael are going to follow in more of non-engineering, I presume. We haven't coordinated really. So a little bit of the outline. I'd like first to frame, and I'm going to spend some time on it, to frame the conversation legally and realistically, because it's important to understand what is the framework that governs the pedestrian movements and pedestrian interactions with other users of the road. Key part of our projects and our way to understanding is observation. So everything that I'm going to discuss today in regards of past research and current ongoing research involves around watching actual people using the facilities. And I'm going to finish with some lessons learned. So this is a verbatim copy from the webpage of the Office of Traffic Safety. Thou shalt not yield. Thou shalt yield. That doesn't sound nice. So basically, this is your, I would take the liberty and say, elementary school direction of how pedestrians should be treated. Motorists must treat every corner and intersection as a crosswalk, whether it's marked or unmarked, and drivers must stop for crossing pedestrians. That is mostly true, but as I'm gonna discuss in the next following slides, not entirely. So before we continue, let's agree on some of the definitions. So the instruction says that drivers need to stop for at a crosswalk marked or unmarked. Well, according to Minnesota Statute 169, the crosswalk is the portion of a roadway where sidewalks are extended logically at intersections, or it's marked as such. So it could be marked at any point of the road. This leaves a little bit open some of the more obscure places where we provide curb side ADA, but there is no actual sidewalk. It's not an intersection. And so bottom line is that a crosswalk is everywhere two roads or more are meeting. And there has to be a sidewalk. Now, a little bit of the fine print. If a pedestrian is crossing a roadway at any point other than a marked crosswalk at an intersection with no marked crosswalk, that means at an intersection that doesn't actually have sidewalks, shall yield the right of way to all vehicles upon the roadway. To me, actually, that was new, because when you read the general description is pedestrians have the right of way everywhere. Well, not entirely. So jaywalking is prohibited, is not legally a violation in Minnesota, but you are supposed to yield the right of way to vehicles. So the other thing is that if there are facilities provided for pedestrians to cross a roadway, like a tunnel or overhead crossing, or you're near an adjacent intersection with traffic control, then the pedestrians shall not cross at any place except those, or has to yield the right of way to vehicles. Actually, I'll come back on this. No. So finally, my last part of fine print is the rights in absence of a signal. So if there's a traffic control signal, the instructions are theoretically clear. But if there is no signal and the pedestrian is using a legal crosswalk, the driver must remain stopped until the pedestrian has passed the lane in which the vehicle is stopped. Basically, what that means, that if you have a multi-lane road, in a crossing on a multi-lane road, the driver can start moving and cross as soon as the pedestrian has moved away from its lane. So if a pedestrian has to cross 3 lanes and the vehicle in the rightmost lane has yielded, as soon as the pedestrian has moved, then it is allowed to continue, even if the pedestrian hasn't completed the crossing. That is a little bit of a fine print that has been generating problems. Of course, it comes with the next piece of fine print, that when a vehicle is stopped at a marked crosswalk or at an intersection, no other vehicle on a different lane will overtake or pass that stopped vehicle. So I said at the beginning that I'm going to frame the discussion in terms of the law, but I'm also going to frame it in terms of reality. All the things that we said so far, they're fine. These are basically the instructions and the language that is going to solve disputes, that is going to decide who has to pay a fine, who is at fault when things are happening. Now, as engineers, our goal is to avoid things from happening in the first place. And because once a crash, a pedestrian collision happens, who's going to pay whom is not the point, according to me at least. So the key part here is that no matter what is the situation, the driver logically must first notice the pedestrian in order to yield. If you haven't seen the pedestrian and acknowledge their intention to cross, then it doesn't really matter who has the right of way. In addition to that, and that comes to the fine print in the previous slide, the driver must realize that this is a pedestrian right of way location. So the driver not only has to see the pedestrian, not only has to acknowledge their intention to cross, that means that they're not just talking on their phone on the sidewalk, but also has to look at the surrounding area and register that as a pedestrian right-of-way location, a marked crosswalk or a unmarked crosswalk at an intersection. On the other hand, what I like to say is that pedestrians are like water. And in building engineering and in civil engineering in generally, basically we'll say that water will find its way. Well, you can never stop water. It will follow the shortest path, and it will go through your basement, it will go through your foundation, it will go through your walls, your ceiling, your roof. Pedestrians are like that. And I like this picture. This is a very recent picture that maybe Greg and Michael say a little bit more. This is Highway 2 in Cass Lake, Minnesota. And basically you can see what we call the GO trails, where people are crossing a 4-lane with a median highway, and the origins at the north, well, actually is the south in the picture, are very clear. One is the school and the other one is the playground, and the destinations vary a little bit. At the very first you have a gas station, then you have the Dairy Queen, and then you have a pizza place. So this is not a difficult location to find crossing. On either sides of this aerial image, in about 500 feet, there are signalized intersections with pedestrian actuated buttons, with pedestrian recall, everything for the pedestrian to cross. But as the GO trails suggest, the pedestrians will always pick the shortest path. So when we're discussing as traffic engineers, traffic safety engineers, treatments, I like to think the subject as an escalation of safety treatments. And for the top set of pictures, I just took a stroll, virtual stroll on around Lake of the Isles in downtown Minneapolis, in uptown Minneapolis. And even in that stroll around the lake, you can see the different treatments that City of Minneapolis has implemented for people to access the lake, the area around the lake. So all of these are crossings that are going from the houses on one side to the path, the trail around the lake. And the very first is basically the do nothing. This is what the law says. You have two roads are meeting, you have curbs, you have sidewalks, you extend those imaginary lines of sidewalks. That is a legal crossing, unmarked crossing, where the pedestrians have the right of way. There is no pedestrian sign, there is no marking on the road. The next point is to elevate the awareness of the drivers. So if that is not enough, then the good question is, what is enough? We'll discuss it later. You need to emphasize that this is not your regular intersection where once every blue moon there might be a pedestrian, but for some reason unknown to the driver, there's more likeliness of having pedestrians there. And in that case, the only thing that you see on the second picture is the yellow sign of a pedestrian. Now, according to the law, that doesn't count as a marked crossing. The marked crossing has to have markings on the pavement. Now, the next is elevated even more. now we have an actual marked crossing. You have the zebra crossing, although kind of fainted in this picture. And you also have better arranged curb lines. And because pedestrians will find their shortest path, very nicely, the Minneapolis park system has put their chains to actually corral the pedestrians so they don't start spreading around and don't take the direct location. The fourth picture is an elevation of that. You have a fully marked crosswalk. This is not an intersection, so this is a mid-block crosswalk. You have added a sign with a placard, and this particular one, I couldn't find one without it. There is a beacon. So all of these are situations. So the first three are legal crosswalks because it is an intersection. The fourth one, it is a marked crosswalk. And you see the escalation of the treatments, and all of them is basically not to establish different right-of-way rules, but to establish the importance for the drivers to look and acknowledge pedestrians and therefore yield. Now, looking at the second row of pictures, these are basically pictures from our projects. So the first two are the same location in Duluth, in Superior Street. And the very first time that we collected observation on that location, it was a very simple marked intersection crosswalk. So it is an intersection and it was marked, but it had absolutely no other indication other than the zebra crossing. This is a very high pedestrian volume, and the city, I don't remember if the city or the county that was there, in the next year implemented a rectangular rapid flashing beacon. So you see exactly the same location. The zebra crossing was just repainted, but the addition of two RRFBs, solar powered, in this location. So we collected information and we wanted to look. It was a very good before and after study to find out just the addition of the RFBs with nothing else changed. How is the driver's behavior change? The third picture is an escalation of treatment. It is again an RFB installation, but in addition to the ones that are on the poles on the sidewalk, we have overhead location of the RFB. So now we have twice as many yellow signs, pedestrian signs, and twice as many RFBs. Ultimate, one can consider it ultimate escalation, the hawk signal. The last picture, bottom right, that is the hawk, that very most recent hawk on Highway 169 at the Mille Lacs Casino. This is, from all of these treatments, the hawk is the only one who is regulatory. There is no regulation other than the yielding to the driver attached to the RFB or the beacon or any other sign. The hawk is regulatory because it is a traffic signal, and during the solid red indication, you're not supposed to cross the crossing, the intersection. So, as I said, all our research at the Minnesota Traffic Observatory, hence our name, depends on observations. We have developed our own camera systems and we have deployed them in all over Minnesota, in roundabouts, in highways, in the middle of nowhere, and in the most heavily populated places. So the very first research, and I want to open the chart just to make sure that I don't lose any questions. The very first research that I had at the MTO was in 2010, where there was a lot of discussions and a lot of problems regarding the safety of pedestrians in modern urban roundabouts. So in that project, basically we selected two very different roundabouts. One was the 2x2 roundabout in Richfield, and the other one was the roundabout at Minnehaha Falls in Minneapolis. Richfield was a bigger one, more crossing, but not that a lot of traffic, not that many pedestrians. The Minnehaha Falls being at the park, it is an older one, shorter crossings, less markings, as you can see in the photos, but a lot of pedestrians and a lot of traffic. So that was this project was my first encounter in the reality that people in Minnesota don't yield to pedestrians. We had a almost 41%, 42% yield rate. So less than half of the drivers yielded on the Richfield roundabout. Because of sheer volume of people, plus the location, and that's one of my points, the Minneapolis yield probability was close to 80%, more than 80%. So we see that the location and the area does affect the driver's decision. Nobody can dispute that in either case, the drivers are fully aware that this is a yield to pedestrian location. In Richfield, there are signs everywhere. It is marked. It cries out. In Minneapolis, there's pedestrians everywhere. Although there aren't that many signs, it's still very clear that you're near a park and people cross. But we see that this huge difference in yield rates. And it's actually getting worse because in Richfield, only 22% of the vehicles exiting the roundabout yielded to pedestrians. So it was very interesting. And we here are some summary findings that basically when the pedestrian is on the island, the probability of yield increases. The hypothesis there is that when the pedestrian is on the island, it's in the middle of the road, there is no ambiguity. The driver cannot pretend that they may not want to cross. So either conscious or unconscious, the importance of yielding to that person becomes more clear. On the other hand, the exits, our hypothesis there was that drivers may needed to exit the roundabout and not be in the area where conflicts were prevalent. Another hypothesis, and unfortunately, none of these were established through data, is that the vehicles exiting the roundabout, they don't have a real clear view of the pedestrian because the crossing is rather away. I don't particularly believe that excuse because there's plenty of room for them to stop before the crossing after the exit, but the numbers don't lie. Another evidence that visibility of the pedestrian makes a difference is the size of the pedestrian group. The larger the group, the higher the probability that the vehicle will yield. In the case of the Ritchie roundabout and some of the locations that I will describe later, we have multi-lane crossings. So what we saw very often is that vehicles will sneak in on the far lane, and so the far lane, as in respect to the pedestrian crossing, has lower yield probability than the lane near where the pedestrian is starting the crossing. Now, one thing that became known and I think helped the industry was that, yes, all of these findings basically say that there was a problem of pedestrians crossing in roundabouts. Drivers don't yield. But when you bring it down to realistic measures, the average crossing delay was 2.3 seconds overall. And if the driver yielded, it was 3.8. If the driver did not yield, it was 10.6 seconds. And in Minneapolis, these were about 1/3 and half less than this. If this was a signalized intersection, the rule of thumb basically says that the delay at the signal is about half of the total cycle length. So in Richfield, with the volumes there, it would have been 30 seconds. So even for the worst case scenario where drivers are not yielding, you still have almost 20 seconds less delay with a regular roundabout pedestrian crossing. So there is the bottom line here is that yes, crossing on a location, and in this case it was a roundabout, but it is the same thing in other places where the yield rate is 40%, is frustrating. But in 12,000 crossings, we didn't see any crashes. We only saw 3 close calls, and it all involved bicyclists that they rode the bicycle across the crossing. And the delay is 1/3 of what it would have been. So yes, it is frustrating. Yes, you have the right of way as a pedestrian, but you're not being awarded the right. You don't enjoy it. But on the other hand, it's not dangerous. So the next project, and the report was published in 2020. The project started in 2018, so I put 2019. We basically hold to assess the impact of a variety of pedestrian activated crossing systems. So these are all systems where either automatically or through a button, the pedestrian activates a mechanism that enhances the message to the driver that they need to yield. So we had 19 RRFPs, 6 flashing LED signs, 4 Hawks sides, and 2 standard signal signs. And we tried to vary obviously the treatment type, but the speed limit, the volume of the vehicles, the number of lanes crossed, if there's an island, so it's a two-stage crossing or one stage, the intersection type, and also the surrounding area, if it's urban, rural, school zone. And you see here some extreme results. In the bottom, you have a high-speed highway. This is actually a school crossing, and you have 8 directions where vehicles can come and interact with the pedestrians crossing. So that's a lot of threats around and a lot of different angles that drivers have to yield. So I'm not gonna go through this side, but just to give you a very quick idea of all the questions that we hoped and tried to answer in this project. And let's look at hoax. The yield rate, as it is nationally advertised, is very high when activated. So when the drivers are in the island, in the case of the 2 of the 4 hoax that had a island in the middle, we're to the 90 and 80%. Interestingly, when you had the hawk crossing, but the destination was not the island, rates were observed to be at the 60%. And at that time, we didn't exactly scrutinize that because the project was mostly interested in RFPs. That's what MNDOT wanted to gather information, because the hope, one unspoken question is, okay, can I avoid spending the 300,000 of a hawk if I put the appropriate RFP or flashing LED? But here we say that basically we see that even when not activated, the yield rates are relatively high. And more importantly, in one of the sites, which was the biggest one, you have the same yield rate starting from the island, activated or not activated. So what basically this indicates that it isn't so much the lights and the control that prompts the right behavior from the drivers, but it's the knowledge. There is all the information that this is a pedestrian crossing, and when the pedestrian is on the island, well, they're in the middle of the road. Where else they're gonna go? They want to cross. So it's interesting that this happens. Obviously, the delay with hawks is relatively high because they have to go through the sequence. Now, I put this photo in, and I don't know if Greg and Michael are going to discuss this site in Mille Lacs. This is the new hawk in Mille Lacs, and I want you to, for the people in the audience who haven't really understood the hawk, the previous slide had, the next slide has the sequence that it works, but it's important to understand that on a road like this, when the pedestrian, let's say it's at the bottom right of the corner of the picture, presses the button to activate the sequence, the hawk goes through the yellow phases, and eventually is going to give the walk sign to the pedestrian. At that point, the pedestrian is allowed to start the crossing. And they have 10 seconds until the flashing red comes in. And the placards on the Hawk basically say that the drivers are allowed to cross during flashing red if there are no pedestrians in the crosswalk. Well, in most cases that we observed, the travel time to the island is more than 10 seconds long, which means that without exception, the second crossing will start at a flashing red. So it's an interesting conundrum here because drivers are asked to stop for a pedestrian that it is 40 to 50 feet away from their point of conflict. And then they're given the go-ahead while the pedestrian hasn't even made it there. So we're going to be investigating this behavior a little bit closer because the Highway 169 in Mille Lacs is right now the Hawk installation at the widest crossing in the state. I believe so. I haven't 100% verified that. I'm pretty sure about it. And the behavior that we see there is more indicative than before because the yield rates are low, and the yield rates at the far end of the crossing are even lower than what we had in St. Cloud and Red Wing. Moving on, because I'm pretty sure I'm running out of time. What I would like to press on, and I'll finish with this. Pedestrian activated crosses are effective at sites that they don't have good sight distances and or advanced warning. The fact that in all our research, in all of them, they, even when deactivated, were not activated, they beat the yielding percentages experienced in unmarked crossings and crossings that did not have, they only had the zebra crossing, basically says that a lot of the benefit comes from the additional static signs. So the RFFBs with overhead mounting had higher yield rates inactive than RFFBs without overhead hanging. Why? Because the more visual stimuli to the drivers reinforce the message that this is a crossing. Speed limits did not make much of a difference. So, and the higher number of movement conflicting with the crosswalk both increased the activation rate, but also increased the importance and the benefit that you're getting from this. And I'm gonna, this is the end of my presentation. I'm gonna pass it to Greg, I believe.
John, thank you very much. Everyone, we're pleased to be here. Michael Pettish and I from Michael's with the MNDOT Department of Transportation are going to move on from John's work, which provided a nice overview of our experience with trying to address pedestrian risk at crossings throughout the state with a more detailed case study. We're going to talk about pedestrian crossings and safety on 4 Anishinaabe reservations here in the state of Minnesota. Michael's going to provide, this is a MNDOT sponsored research project. Michael's going to provide an overview of that and establish the context and the objectives for it. And then I'll talk about the results and some implications. We'll try to foster some discussion about the challenges addressing pedestrian safety and risk. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Michael. Michael's an alum of our program, and he's gone from being sort of my collaborator in research to now my boss. He oversees our projects. So we're going to let Michael, he's a pedestrian and bicyclist data coordinator at MNDOT, provide the introduction to the project here. Michael?
Wonderful. Thanks, Greg. Are you able to do it in presenter mode? Just make the slides bigger.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Thank you again for the invitation, and glad to see there's 70 people on the call. So thank you very much for taking time out of your day, and really excited to share our perspective and the work that we've done so far on this project. I guess before I start, as Greg said, this was a MNDOT sponsored project, but his team, Greg Lindsay and a few researchers, as well as John Hortos from the University of Minnesota, have been very, very helpful with all the information collected and analysis and everything. And I just want to give a big shout out to the other MNDOT districts that have been involved, as well as county partners, MNDOT Tribal Affairs, and the tribal nations, who without any one of them, the projects would not be as successful as they have been. So it's a huge multi-jurisdictional effort. I wanted to start with MNDOT's mission, which is to plan, build, operate, and maintain a safe, accessible, efficient, and reliable multimodal transportation system that connects people to destinations and markets throughout the state, regionally, and around the world. So I just wanted to hit on a few specific, a few of the words. So safe, accessible, multimodal, and connecting people to destinations. So as we are moving into a more mobility-focused department, we are looking at all ways in which people interact with each other and move through their environment. And this project that we're sharing is a good example of how we are shifting our lens towards equitably and safely addressing many needs, transportation needs around the state. Next slide, please. So several different projects, programs, policies that MNDOT is involved with relate to pedestrian safety. So Towards Zero Deaths is one that there's many different partners around the state of Minnesota. MNDOT is a part of that. We have Safe Routes to School that solicits and funds many different infrastructure and non-infrastructure projects around the state. We got, able to go back a couple, Greg?
Michael, you want to, this one?
One more back. Yeah,
This
right
one?
here. Oh, there we go. We got the statewide multimodal plan that is incorporating all of the modes around the states. That's updated every 5 years, I believe. We also have lots of equity initiatives, and also how we define equity and include that in other projects. And then Minnesota Walks that provide a good framework for the now pedestrian plan. Next slide, please. So this project, this rural pedestrian safety research project, it kind of evolved from two different ongoing efforts at MNDOT that I was involved with at the time, back in 2016. And it's related to Minnesota walks and how there were many different priority populations identified, many of which, because walking is just either part of the culture or people in these groups are more likely to walk around to meet their daily needs. And then also the bicycle and pedestrian counting program, data collection initiatives that I have been working with at the state. We had limited knowledge and ability to detect people biking and walking in rural areas that would not go along or across a specific screen line or a line in the stand that they were passing by. And we also had, we knew that there were equity concerns, and especially in rural locations with lower pedestrian volumes, there were questions about how many people does it take to meet a warrant for a specific intervention or something. So looking at ways in which we can address warrants versus risk exposure and other things. Next. And so over the years, MNDOT, these are by no means because of me, but I've just been involved with several of these initiatives and a lot of relationship building with tribal nations all throughout the state, the 11 tribal nations in Minnesota. And so we have the Advocacy Council for Tribal Transportation, which is many different partners discussing safety and accessibility and other things with the state. Many different types of agreements, treaty boundary, language signing, lots of different ways in which we have previously coordinated with tribal nations, and many of these were influential in how we have been successful in our current project. Next, please. And I also wanted to give a little bit of context, traffic safety context for Reservation within Minnesota. Generally, there's a culture of walking and bicycling. It's built and ingrained within the culture, and there's tends to be also low car ownership. Also, large roadway networks that are tricky to maintain or repair with sometimes limited resources. They're often not walking or biking friendly. There's lots of logging and high speeds and big trucks and farm equipment and other things that travel through these corridors, and oftentimes they're going from point A to point B without the drivers without entirely understanding the local context for the area in which they're driving through. Native Americans have the highest rate of roadway fatalities and injuries of any race. And there's also limited trust with state institutions because of boarding schools, because of genocide, because of lots of different things. And so there's hesitation in working with state organizations like the university or like MNDOT. Next. However, as I described with several of those initiatives a few slides back, we've been able to make fantastic headways and rely on many different people within MNDOT as well as other local contacts to kind of build on the relationships that have been established and in trust. And in 2016, we were able to partner and consult with 4 of the tribal nations, so Voice Fork, Grand Portage, Fond du Lac, and Mille Lacs, and those made up the 4 tribal nations that were involved in phase 1 of our rural pedestrian safety project, where we were essentially looking at specific locations that the communities knew where pedestrians were exposed to experiencing greater risk and danger along and across mostly MNDOT roads. Next. And so this is what our working title for our report, phase 1 report was, pedestrian crossings and safety on 4 emission reservations. And as I just said, phase 1 included 4 reservations and 10 specific intersections or crossings within those 4 reservations. Those were identified in partnership with the local tribal representatives, tribal councils, and then also took into account other safety reports and studies and things, tribal safety analysis or safety reports that have been identifying these sites for many years in safe routes to school plans or otherwise, even some county plans, or maybe not county plans, safe routes to school plans, and then worked with them to identify the best ways in which we could collect useful and quantitative information, and that resulted in video being the best option because of the limitations of other types of counting specifically, and that's where John Horos and MTO really came into the picture. And preparing monitoring plans and collecting the video and working with students to reduce the video to numbers that can be tallied up and analyzed, and then bringing all that information to all the parties and road authorities involved in each individual location to sit around the same table and discuss what does this really mean, what resources are available to improve or reduce the risk in these areas that we've known about for a long time and that this data finally shows. So next slide. And yeah, that's where I was going to hand it over to Greg and the university's great work.
Well, thank you, Michael. Thank you for that introduction and for your leadership on the project overall. And thank you for mentioning John, because it was John's work at the MTO and his staff and students who helped us put together the data for this work. What I'd like to do is provide an overview of phase 1 results and then go into some detail at 2 of the reservations, and from there move to discuss the implications. And there we hope to foster some conversation. So that'll be the next few minutes here. So we were looking at numbers of pedestrian crossings at 10 sites and their interactions with vehicles. We saw that the numbers were small as anticipated. They ranged from 4 people per daylight hours to 136. The number of people, the proportion of people making crossings who interacted with vehicles ranged from 9 to 54%. We defined interaction with vehicles as whether or not the vehicle or the pedestrian altered their trajectory. This was a visual observation, it wasn't measurement, but the idea was to understand how often, how frequently people or drivers, pedestrians or drivers, change their trajectory, change what they were doing because of concern about of interactions. We identified potential countermeasures in consultations with tribal representatives and district engineers at 6 locations because of plans, projects, or because of opportunities that emerged. Countermeasures have actually been programmed and scheduled for construction at 3, and they've been implemented just this year at 2 sites, at Mill Lacs and Grand Portage. And we'll talk about those in a second. I think one of the outcomes of this project was increased collaboration among tribes, MNDOT, counties, and the university. And it's led to a second phase where we're repeating the initial exploratory work on Leech Lake, Red Lake, and White Earth reservations. And we're going to follow up with post-construction evaluation of the phase 1 countermeasures. So for example, John was just in Mill Lacs collecting video of hawk operations, and we'll follow that with that we'll follow that installation with additional research. So to give you an idea of the type of field situations we found here, this is the Grand Portage Reservation up in northeastern Minnesota on the Canadian border. And here, tribal representatives were concerned about people living in the subdivision to the north, walking across 161 to the trading post, which is there at the below 61 in this picture. There are also, there's a couple roadways that people take for that distance is about half a mile. And what we'll see in a second, and you can see John talked about goat paths. Here when we look northeast on 61, you can see a roadway that comes, it's a gravel road called Blazes Pit Road that comes from the subdivision, and you can see one of the goat paths where pedestrians walk down the embankment to go to the post office and to the trading post. But we counted for 13 to 15 days. We observed, as you can see there, 150 to 200 pedestrians at the two crossing sites. So it's a small number of people, a dozen a day. And some days were busier than others. And about a fifth of the people crossing had interactions with vehicles or stopped and waited while they came along. As a result of that, it turned out that MnDOT had scheduled a resurfacing of Highway 61 this summer. And because of the project and because of the information about where people were crossing, MnDOT was able to incorporate into the project new countermeasures. These include gate-posted crossing signs at the two places where there's been a lot of crossing, the informal one and at a formal road crossing further to the north. There's continental block pavement markings at both places, and they added sidewalk and trail facilities to provide to lead to the crosswalk so pedestrians would have a place to wait. In addition, to help warn drivers, MnDOT was able to put in place LED blinker lights indicating peds and bikes for the next mile. The idea was to think about this as a corridor so that when people enter the heart of the reservation where there's a greater population density, people will be more aware. And they have that distance includes the two crossing locations and road segments where pedestrians and bicyclists have been observed. And so this is a situation in which knowledge about where people, in some cases adolescents, were crossing the road independently, we were able to incorporate in a planned project marginal changes that help address the safety issues of concern to the tribal community. John has already showed you an example of the hawk that's now been installed at Mille Lacs. We'll give you some of the backstory here. There's been long-term concerns about pedestrians crossing Highway 169 from the subdivision and community areas on the east to get to either the casino, employment, or to get to the grocery store, the Grand Market there. And what we can see is there are two principal places of people are crossing. Up here in the yellow, this is an informal crossing. Down here is a crosswalk. You can see it better at this particular location. John talked earlier about how people are going to flow there where they want to do. There was a fence here that had been closed off along the frontage road, trying to prevent pedestrians crossing, and people cut holes in it so that they could make this walkway here. And here, near the entrance to the casino, a crosswalk had been built. When we monitored at both places. And what we see is that the informal crossing that's uncontrolled, there were 136 people per day. At the formal crossing, there were 4 per day. And so again, the situation where the people who lived here or on the other side of the Grand Market were going to and from where their origins and their destinations, the shortest path. And this was a concern. This gives an example. For example, mother crossing a stroller, children on bikes, people walking in the median. So Mille Lacs was able to put together transportation alternatives funding for the Hawk signal. It was completed just this fall. And as I mentioned, we're now going to do a phase 2 evaluation. So if you think about what this is involved, the project was conceived in 2016. We began monitoring in 2017. With the results, the Mille-Lacs tribe applied for and received TAP funding from MNDOT. Design and planning occurred in 2020. There was some delay with COVID. Construction began in 21. Mille-Lacs now has posted a training video, and we're starting with phase 2. So it gives you an idea of the outcomes associated with a research project that was trying to document levels of risk. So there's some insights I think we can draw from the project that actually present some challenges to us as we think about how best to address pedestrian safety concerns throughout the state, and particularly on reservations and in other rural areas. We found that the daily crossing volumes were low. None of the locations met warrants, and none of the locations that the tribe council and transportation managers identified were ranked highly or even included on countywide safety plans. However, the risk that we identified is real. People don't expect to see, for example, children walking across Highway 169 unaccompanied by adults at a place where there's no crossing. One of the things that this issues that shows is because the sites that we investigated were those identified by the tribal elders and the transportation managers, oftentimes in response to concerns expressed by reservation residents, tribal members, was that the lived experience is important and it can be addressed. Another insight from the project is that collaboration is essential. What we found was that the more we had MNDOT engineers with tribal representatives, county engineers, people from the university talking about options, they're able to identify things that could be fit into projects that already have been planned. Sometimes these are lower cost types of countermeasures. Other times, like the Hawk, they're more expensive. And the issue that I think I want to highlight here is that this begins to address equity concerns that people have raised because of the historic treatment of Native Americans throughout the US. So that's our phase 1 summary. And I want to now raise these other issues. I want to thank first all the people that have involved. And you can see here, I mentioned collaboration. There are institutional funders and collaborators. MNDOT, the Ford Anishinaabe bands, the CTS was supportive. People at the Roadway Safety Institute provided guidance. The MTO collected data. I want to shift now, and I want to talk about the issues it raises. And those same people that made the projects responsible aren't responsible here for anything I'm going to say. So I'll absolve them of guilt. So I want to talk with reflection about issues that occurred because I think they're recurring. And I think that as we strive to address pedestrian safety, which I think is essential to address issues of, for example, climate change, issues of public health and obesity, issues of equity and safety, issues and tensions are going to emerge. And I want to share the ones that emerged here. For example, when we first met with MNDOT district and county engineers, we were asked, why are these sites being studied? They didn't show up in our safety plans. We used a systematic approach. We looked at risk factors associated with crashes. We looked at risk factors associated with pedestrian activity. We did that comprehensively throughout the university. And these locations didn't rise to the level of concern. And if you document this risk, now you're going to create expectations that we're going to address it. And we don't have money to address all these problems. So how are we going to deal with this? And the tribal transportation representatives were coming from a different perspective. They talked about historical trauma and the lack of investment and how this has been historic mistrust with MNDOT and other state agencies. When we talked about small volumes of people, they said, well, we are more than just small numbers. The pedestrian risk is our lived experience. There's issues that this raises about equity considerations. And what do we do when we think addressing risk is the right thing to do, but the measures that we've used to establish risk generally don't address this other type of lived experience? Now, my experience in working for pushing 40 years now with people in state agencies, engineers in transportation environment, is that they're trained hard, they're trained and they work extraordinarily hard to be efficient and fair, to deploy things like the systematic approach, where we try to make our prioritization of the best scarce public dollars as efficient and fair as possible. But I think it's true, as our project illustrates, they don't always capture lived experience. There are always other factors that come in. And in fact, as Michael pointed out with his comments on the need for more data about biking and walking, oftentimes we don't know where people are walking or how many people are walking or how many people are interacting. So we're using surrogate measures to try to assess risk to people. And so in some ways, we never really know the relative trade-offs between efficiency and equity. We do extraordinary jobs to be fair, but at some point, our technical knowledge gives way to judgment. And so we're doing more and more. We're developing methods and tools for measuring demand and assessing exposure to risk, but we aren't there yet. So I think the project does two things. It raises sets of issues. It illustrates the relative efficiency, the relative number affected across locations, which we always want to know because that's critical to a public investment. But at the same time, it illustrates and brings to the fore the question of equity. And where do we trade off? Where do we think about it's the right thing to do to make these investments or to incorporate them in a project? Because historically, there's been problems and because the risks are real. And so sometimes actually knowing more can make our decisions more complicated. And so if we think about it broadly, and I think that this case, whether it could be applied generally to most rural communities, the systematic approach to risk ranking in county safety plans didn't identify these sites. And if we were going to strictly adhere to those, we would have never made any of these investments. Trade-offs between efficiency and equity and priority investments are inherently value laden. And the technical analyses that we make, they bound debates, but they don't ultimately eliminate the subjectivity of that is reflected in the value choices that we make. And so, I don't have solutions to these questions, but I think they're important for us to discuss because as you see us moving forward in trying to achieve the complicated goals that MNDOT has along with other state agencies. For example, if we look at disproportionate risk, pedestrian risk, we see it's higher in North Minneapolis and other places in the city. We're going to need to think about, do our standard approaches need tweaking and when do we deviate from those? I hope this gives you some ideas, some food for thought. As I said, these are sort of my ideas. They're things I've been thinking about quite a lot as we've been going through this project. I think that the folks who've made this possible deserve to be commended because we're beginning to wrestle with these issues, but I think we have a long way to go. So thanks for letting us share our work today. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
Great. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, John. Important issues. We've got a great audience. I know we've got some good questions out there. I hope you'll share those with us. Joe is going to lead us in that Q&A.
All right, thank you, Tony. So reminder to use the chat box down at the bottom, or I'm sorry, the Q&A box to submit questions that you might have for our presenters. I see we only have one so far, so to give a chance for those questions to roll in, I will lead off with a couple questions here. First one, I'll direct at Greg because it was in your last couple of slides here. You mentioned that the locations that you studied on the tribal nations were not showing up in the county safety plans, but yet you seem to observe quite a few pedestrian crossings that were there through your research. Is there a particular reason that you saw that those locations were not being reflected in safety plans?
Well, oftentimes exposure isn't included in risk ranking at the county level because there aren't measures of exposure. So we use surrogates. And so when we use surrogates, we know, or factors affiliated with crashes, we often can get an idea of those things that have correlated with historic crashes. We may, in some cases, understand destinations. And so, for example, if we see, like at the reservation, a gas station mini mart that may be the only food store in a small town, we know that people will be going there. So we can get that idea. But oftentimes, we don't know how many people are walking on streets or where they are. And the truth is, when you're going 55 miles an hour, say on Highway 61, and you see woods on either side, you don't expect to see a child pop out of the trees. And so I think that if part of it, Joe, is that we historically haven't had that data. And that's why I personally think that the work that MNDOT is leading and that many local jurisdictions are now implementing to try to get better bike and ped counts is really important, because it can give us more data to try to understand how we're going to make these investments.
All right, thank you so much. The second question I'll put out to both John and to Greg. So John spent a good chunk of his presentation reviewing some of the statutory framework behind pedestrian crossings and where those rights are established longitudinally along the roadway, but didn't talk so much about laterally. So, for example, which portions are considered part of the crosswalk for the purpose of legal yielding requirements, and also for your research. And then likewise for Greg, for what you were observing on the in the tribal nations, how were drivers reacting to the presence of pedestrians who were on the shoulder or within a median?
Okay, so just to understand the question, you're talking about laterally down lane. What are the boundaries of the crosswalk?
For the purpose of your calculations, were you including shoulders? Were you including the ramp behind the curb? Were you including the sidewalk area behind the ramp? What were the limits you used?
Yeah, so in our calculations, we marked the time that the pedestrian came in view. So that means that the pedestrian actually stepped on the ADA pad or equivalent. And that is the time that the pedestrian saw it intent. And the start of the crossing is when the pedestrian actually steps a foot on down the curb. So it steps a foot on the pavement and crosses the fog line or whatever, or the very first wide strip of the zebra crossing, whatever is there. But those times are separated. So the delay, for example, was calculated between the time that included the time the pedestrian was standing at the ADA pad or at the sidewalk before they actually stepped a foot in. Does that answer your question?
For the delay, certainly yes, but I also wanted to put the question of the legal requirement as to what is expected of drivers in those situations.
As far as I understand, and I looked at it a lot, I've read the statutes many times, the pedestrian has to be in the crosswalk, has to be away from the curb. So he has to have stepped on the roadway, and then the driver is required to yield. I don't find that, I mean, initially when I heard about it, I was kind of laughing that you have to put yourself in the harm's way to make the other person yield. But on the other hand, when we're discussing legal matters, you have to be crystal clear. Because it's mostly liability reasons. When the legal aspect comes in, is after the fact the bad effect has happened. Who cares? That's what I'm saying, that our purposes is not to look at it so much on the legal point of view, because we want to avoid the event, the crash, collision, conflict, annoyance to happen in the first place, not to help the lawyers figure it out afterwards. So, but yeah, now one interesting thing that I haven't found out is where the island stands in all of this. According to the statute, if the two sides of the same roadway separated by a median are more than 30 feet away, then each crossing is considered a separate crossing. Because each intersection, so when you're crossing Highway 55, it's a two-stage crossing because you're crossing one road and then you cross the next road. So the island, as it is with the no man's zone for vehicles, in between the roadways is not part of the crossing. On the other hand, a lot of the islands that we have in urban areas, they are not that big. They're 10, 15 feet wide. So that doesn't make it to the 30 feet limit. So are they part of the crossing, or they separate the crossing in two legal aspects? That is not very well defined.
Greg, did you have anything you wanted to add as far as how drivers were reacting to that in tribal areas?
Yeah, when we were walking, when we were monitoring, we did not track specific vehicle or driver reactions to people walking either for or against traffic on the freeway. Now, anecdotally, there would be swerving, that type of activity, if they were close on the shoulder. In terms of the sites that had a median, for example, Mill Lacs, we had different types of, some drivers would speed up. They saw people on a median, some would slow down, some would stop. We had different types of behaviors. And those are things that we're going to look at very carefully with this phase 2 evaluation to see how their movements track with the lights on the hawk signal.
All right, thank you both. So we had a couple questions in the Q&A box. One, I think this is a question for Greg. What are the speed limits on the tribal roads that were examined?
Yeah, I typed in an answer to that. A couple were 30 or 40. These are documented in the report. I think it was 55 in Grand Portage. John or Michael, do you recall Mill Lacs?
I just dropped an answer too. There has been a couple of cases where the speed limit was 65, and those were the rare cases where technically there is no official crossing there, but people do cross. In most cases, the vast majority, the speeds are 45, but I'd like to emphasize the fact that especially in the rural areas and around the tribal reservations, the speed limit is temporarily dropped from 65 to 45 for 3/4 of a mile, half a mile, which is the town limits or the important area or the habitable area, and then is raised again. So although the speed limit is legally 45, because it has been at 65 and it's going to be 65 again in 3/4 of a mile, the effective speed limit is the effective speed of the vehicle is much higher than that. So nobody makes it down to 45, because by the time they see the message, the sign drop to 45, they're already past it. They have already come to the crosswalk and so on. So Bina, for example, the speeds were almost always 50 and 55, although the posted speed limit was 45.
Okay, I have a couple more questions in the chat box here, at least that came in to me in the chat box, but one says, for John, statute isn't a straight line to behavior, but our statutes do our statutes generally make sense? Or are there things that you would recommend? I would put that same question to Greg and to Michael.
They do make sense, but there are some remaining ambiguities. For example, as I said, the island area is a remaining ambiguity. The majority of the islands don't fall into the 30 feet separation. The other the other thing that has happened and I've seen many times is that we place ADA pads in the middle of a block where there may or may not be, or there is an interruption in the curb, may or may not be a sidewalk. So it's not an intersection, and according to the statute, it's not an unmarked crosswalk, because an unmarked crosswalk is where the extension of sidewalks crosses the road. So, but we geometrically actually put things there in making it look like a crosswalk. So it is not clear as to what that is. It would have been clear to say, if you put an ADA pad and a half dome, it's a crossing, but it doesn't say that.
I would add something, not specifically to the exact example, but I guess since we all shared information with regards to the crossing in Mille Lacs, there's some engineering judgment that goes into the calibration of these devices, and I think all too often there's not enough resource or interest in doing a post-construction evaluation, which we've been able to do with this one. And as John was saying, there were some things that we have observed in the post-construction that raises some concerns in terms of a person that's driving a car that is expected to stop and yield for pedestrian that is entering from the far side of the intersection, and then is being essentially let go by the return of the flashing lights before the person is able to exit the entire crosswalk. So thinking about, they're trade-offs, but they're also impacting real and human people, and just what sorts of conditions and context in that area is really most important for us.
I'm not an attorney and I don't design things to meet statutes, so I don't feel particularly competent to address this. In general, as in some ways illustrated by a couple of our examples, I'm more concerned about culture and incentives and trying to design to induce the right behavior than I am trying to think about additional statutes to try to govern behavior. Because I think the goat paths that we see, I think that other types of activities that we see, for example, walking down the road a particular way, I think we can address through education, cultural shifts. Now, Mille Lacs, I think, has done a nice job of producing a video that's available on YouTube to train members to use the activated switch. Not all do when they actually, we haven't finished the phase 2 evaluation. We're just starting it, in fact. But we can see how many people are beginning to activate it. And we can see, we've seen now examples of children coming up by themselves, activating the switch, waiting and using it. And that didn't exist before. And so I think that education can be important. And also, there'll be education of drivers, because people in Mille Lacs are used to, for example, at that location, anticipating the existing stoplight southbound by the casino. And people who repeat that drive are going to have to change to a new piece of infrastructure. I think education can help with that as well. I guess that's not surprising from an educator, but that's my point of view.
Yeah, one more point on that. Yeah, we can also remove or we can introduce a technology or an automated detector in those instances potentially as well. So that might be an additional option in terms of if a person walks up to the crosswalk, they're automatically detected and are not required to press a button and require that action to happen. Walking around in the city with navigating snowbanks and things, oftentimes they're blocking the push buttons. So just trying to think of as many resources and as options as possible.
One of the questions I saw in the chat, I want to address this because it follows up on Michael's comment. And that is, is there movement towards new monitoring technologies to help us understand behaviors? In these remote rural areas, the holy grail, the long-term objective would be video with artificial intelligence to address it. Now that may present some problems someplace. There are issues of trust. So for example, we were advised that the tribal council approval was essential because otherwise people would be concerned about surveillance. But if we can move towards these technologies, we'll have better understanding of the distribution of pedestrian bicycle volumes around the state. And then I think we'll be able to be more consistent in our assessments of exposure. And an example would be in this particular case, when the Hawk was installed, there's also an infrared counter that counts people. So we can validate our estimates of the frequency that people use the push button to activate the signal. And I think more generally, if we're thinking about, for example, building a trail with tap money adjacent to a roadway to minimize people, if that cost us, $250,000, $500,000 a mile, an infrared inductive loop counter to count pedestrians to see if it uses $10,000. One of my old bosses used to call it budget dust. And I think we ought to think about investing in some of these technologies for evaluation as we build so that we can have a feedback loop and assess whether we're having the effects we want to.
All right, thank you, Greg. I see we have a couple more questions in the chat box that aren't answered yet, but I will put my first question actually to Tony for the schedule, because I know there was a round robin built in at the end here and we're at our time. How do you wish to proceed?
Joe, I think we have a little bit more time, and if you don't mind, I'd take a crack at one of the questions I saw in the chat. So I'll read the question and then just add a little bit on my own. The question says, how should safety plans incorporate pet safety and equity? The current process is focused on vehicles. And I think the question's from a process perspective, and I guess I would add to this, is it the role of safety plans to think about this, or is it more of a localized question that really fits better into a scoping project development type process where you kind of got a sense of your limits of your project and who that community might be, and you can have some more targeted conversations. I don't know if MnDOT's thought at all about how to implement some of these thoughts into processes.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
But
Yeah,
let me take a stab at it. I'm not going to try to speak for MnDOT, but I want to speak more generally about this. And I think that if we want to redress past injustices, if we want to address equity, then we need to think systematically about how it's structurally embedded in our system, and think about both things at the system level and the project level. And that may be, for example, we can look at, with a safety plan, look at relative crash rate, not just across the county as a whole, but whether projected crash numbers from our safety performance functions predict lower or higher levels in poor, disenfranchised neighborhoods. And if we do that, then we might want to think about emphasizing that, even though there are other factors that are different. But these decisions, I don't think can, again, my distrust of legislation can be in terms of mandates for these things. I think what makes most sense in this context is to embed them in the process so that equity becomes a driving consideration either in the project or the program, so that issues are always front and center. And then we look at that. Now, administratively, these are things that legislatures would have to decide, things like whether there are specific set-asides to go to deal with particularly priority populations, to look at past inequities. So there are some that, I think we have to target the intervention to the decision-making authority, but where we have responsibility, we can try to implement those and remove barriers. And so I think about some of those things.
Yeah, and I think those are good points. Also, just reiterating that equity isn't an outcome, it's a process. And just realizing that some of the best ways to get towards equitable outcomes is really communicating open and honestly and often with all the authorities that are in the room, or even those that aren't. We spent a lot of time trying to figure out who the right people were to talk to, who needed to connect with one another. Lots of resources and expertise that was called upon by within the districts, the MNDOT districts themselves. And ultimately, we know that as this research project, and we're essentially coming into a community, providing some resources, giving data, and then leaving. And it's not. There has to be in order to be having a lasting relationship or a lasting outcome, we really have to make the relationships between the tribes and between the districts that the tribes are within, and between the counties and the tribes that the tribes are within, and making sure that we're meshing together as big of a network of relationships that are trusting and honored as possible. There's a lot of, in this project, even though we're producing hard numbers and things, there's a lot of soft skills that are involved. And listening is huge, and respecting the importance or the opinions of elders in the tribal councils. There's a lot of historical context and knowledge that they have that we will never have. And as I said, equity is a process and not an outcome. So it's just being willing to go beyond the original quote unquote scope of the project. And as this project kind of has done, but I think it has resulted in much better received and much better outcomes for the people that are all involved.
Great, thanks. I think we will try to get to the round robin. Before we get there, though, I just want to bring up one point that was mentioned in the Q&A about how important the language we use is, and it was we've all used words that maybe aren't perfect, but instead of goat pass, we might think about just well-worn footpaths instead. But so we got some time to share a little bit about what you all are up to in the audience. We have a few questions. You can feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to speak, or enter something in the chat, and then I can read those out loud. But the questions for you all are, what current transportation safety and traffic flow issues are you and your organization facing? Do you have any organizational, informational, or event updates to share? And do you have any ideas for future council meeting topics or speakers? We'd like to hear those. And let me see if I can enter that in the chat. Oops, Katie's got those in the chat already. And Gina helpfully reminded us that there's a webinar on December 2nd that might interest you from the Shared Mobility Collaborative, talking about electrification in the right of way. And so the link is there in the chat for everyone. So I don't see anybody with raised hands. One interesting question that I'd like to put on the list for a potential future topic is, we talk about traffic flow here, and that access to destinations is important for a lot of things, for quality of life and economics. of our region. But we are also starting a lot of conversations about VMT reductions and climate change. And so it'd be fun to just hear some speakers and talk about kind of where those things conflict and where there might be opportunities for to try and disentangle that conflict. I think would be a fun question to spend some time on. So anybody want to raise their hand or enter any updates in the chat? Any thoughts about future topics? We've talked about access to destinations measures in the past as a step forward for measuring kind of mobility. We regularly talk about connected and autonomous vehicles. We've talked about pedestrian safety in the past, but definitely welcoming any ideas you might have. Maybe our guest speakers today have ideas that we should be thinking about in the world of mobility or safety more generally.
Well, in regards to the questions about the safety plans, but also to the other question regarding monitoring infrastructure. I think with the terms of vehicles, because of the benefit that they can only operate on roadways, and we have a lot of measuring stations along the way, we know where they go, where they're coming from, how many they are. We don't have the similar thing for pedestrians. We have count pedestrians on trails, and we can indirectly count them when they're crossing an intersection by counting how many buttons are pressed, for example. But there is no actual monitoring infrastructure. Now, on top of that, when we're talking about a safety plan, I'm not an expert, but in terms of the vehicles, we're looking at risk factors, and we multiply the risk factor to the exposure. How many vehicles are doing the same maneuver that has that risk factor? With pedestrians, it has to be a little different, because the whole point is, where are the attractions? Where are the destinations and the origins? Now with the project that I'm working with Greg and Michael, I have been exposed a lot with rural communities and rural Minnesota. And you see that the occasional gas station, the occasional grocery store, the occasional some other kind of commerce, they become focal points. It is impossible to predict all the movements of all pedestrians going from one house to another house. But you see clearly that they can be walking for miles to go to that one grocery store. And during their trip, they will cross a major highway. So, and right now with this project, we went through a lot of discussion and a lot of communication with local people to a handful of locations, identify where are these most used undocumented crossing locations. I think that there are ways through remote sensing and of the worn path trails, of other GIS work, that we can actually, in more organized and more expansive way, find out where people are crossing the road. And then focus to do audits like we do on with regular roads, to do safety audits based on locations where we expect people to be, instead of waiting for the unfortunate event to happen and then going and, well, the chances that an unfortunate event is going to happen at that location is very rare. Unfortunately, it's going to happen somewhere else that we haven't thought about yet. So we need a more organized way. And I think, at least for the rural communities, it is not impossible with the information that we have right now from remote sensing, GIS, all the surveys, and we know where people think, Google knows where everybody is. So I think it's possible to create a heat map around the state and say, these are the locations where people crossing the road, and highlight the ones that are 65 miles an hour or 50 miles an hour.
Yeah, and
That's an idea.
And yeah, I think there's a lot of technology and ways to identify those hotspot areas, but also bringing it to the communities, bringing those heat maps to the communities to essentially ground truth and collect and overlay their anecdata and their stories and their lived experiences Greg was mentioning in his presentation, to really validate, are those really the right locations, or is it 200 feet to the west? And you're really using all the information. Stories are still valid pieces of information and data that we want to use it all to make sure that we are directing our precious resources towards the biggest improvement for everyone. So yes, there's a lot of ways in which we can do it, but I also don't want to discount or leave out of the picture the fact that people have lived experiences and can they know what is dangerous. They can perceive danger, and they're often very willing to tell you about that too.
Thank you, Michael. And I just mentioned that, MnDOT's really been a leader in using streetlight data systems. And I think that's starting to give us a better picture of where pedestrian activity is. And to Greg Lindsay's point about pedestrian demand, that, I'm not sure how widespread it is across the state, but, we have GIS data about land use, and, how that interacts across highways is probably a interesting question, and could probably be developed into a model that predicts those kind of crossings. But
yeah, if you don't mind, I will mention that. So my office is the Office of Transit and Active Transportation within MnDOT. So we're in St. Paul. We're somewhat the consultants for the rest of the state. But several of my colleagues, as well as in the Office of Traffic Engineering, have developed several different ways to analyze and overlay publicly available information. So like likelihood that a household will have one car, or commuting, likelihood that a household will walk or bike or take transit for commuting purposes. Number of households with kids under 10 years old or something, senior citizens, proximity to parks, churches, other things. So we are looking at, and we have developed ways in which we can overlay these pieces of seemingly disparate information, but also they are all directly related to how people want to or desire to get around their neighborhood, walking and biking, and many of those trips are short and sweet, should be short and sweet. So they should be easily served and accessible by simple modes, walking and biking, and not necessarily driving. So our office is and has developed a couple of those tools. One is called the SPACE tool, the suitability and pedestrian accessibility and cyclist environment, I think is what it is. And then there's also pedestrian accessibility and walking score something like that. It's pause. Anyway, you can, there's ways in which you can look it up on our website, or I'm happy to share more information if anyone wants to reach out and discuss.
Great. And we do have one raised hand, so we're gonna pass it to Chris Ryan just for a couple of minutes before we end here.
Hi, Chris Ryan with HDR here. I just want to tag onto the note about streetlight data being used for pedestrian analysis. I wanted to quickly mention that we're currently working with MNDOT on their statewide rail safety action plan. And what we're using streetlight to try to estimate pedestrian activity at each rail crossing in Minnesota as a way to try to get at some of the information, since pedestrian deaths is a very hot topic in rail safety. So just wanted to mention that that is happening.
Yeah, that's great, because I think that same procedure would probably apply to highway crossings. Well, do want to thank our speakers and thank everyone for attending today. Thank CTS staff for putting this together, and hope everybody has a good and safe day.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, everyone.